In January 2026, the United States executed a massive withdrawal from the global community by formally exiting 66 international governance bodies, including the UN Human Rights Council and the Paris Agreement. The administration severed decades of diplomatic and economic integration to enforce strict national isolation. The economic strategy behind this isolation relied on applying extreme pressure to international trade. By imposing tariff rates as high as 50% on imported goods, the state intended to make foreign products too expensive to buy, theoretically forcing corporations to relocate all their manufacturing and mineral extraction back onto domestic soil. But bringing heavy industry back to the United States requires physical labor, and the domestic workforce lacks the capacity to supply it. The baby boomer generation has aged out of the labor pool, and subsequent generations have produced birth rates far too low to replace them. The essential base layer industries, mining, agriculture, and lumber, are empty. Simultaneously, the federal government allocated $170 billion to rapidly expand immigration and customs enforcement operations. By systematically detaining up to 68,000 individuals a day in massive military tent camps, the state actively removed the remaining traditional migrant workforce that historically sustained domestic supply chains. The government can issue executive orders to deregulate protected lands and expand oil drilling, but raw materials do not extract themselves. An isolationist economy requires millions of human hands to function. To solve this physical labor shortage, the state turned inward. If they could not import cheap labor, and they could not utilize a migrant workforce, they needed to manufacture a new demographic of desperate available workers from within the existing American working class. This animated graph illustrates exactly how that was engineered. On the top line, the cost of daily necessities skyrockets due to the heavy tariffs on imported goods. On the bottom line, the government passes legislation slashing nearly $187 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program over 10 years. Working-class citizens are squeezed between soaring grocery bills and the total loss of their federal safety net. When cash flow evaporates, families redirect their remaining stagnant wages entirely towards food. This immediately triggers defaults on rent and utility payments, pushing millions of previously stable lower to middle-class citizens out of their homes and directly onto the streets. The resulting wave of homelessness provides the exact resource the administration requires: a massive, economically broken population with no remaining financial leverage. Once displaced, these citizens encounter the Streets Initiative. Utilizing a $100 million federal pilot program, the government explicitly defunds traditional housing-first models, replacing them with abstinence-only compliance centers that criminalize the act of living unhoused. Police sweep the streets and funnel individuals directly into the civil court system. Here, judges deploy assisted outpatient treatment mandates, court orders that force individuals to comply with state medical directives or face immediate, indefinite involuntary commitment in state facilities. The capture mechanism extends beyond the unhoused to target neurodivergent populations through the medical supply chain. Sweeping day-one personnel cuts at the FDA removed the regulatory friction preventing defective generic medications from reaching the market. Millions of generic ADHD pills, improperly blended with raw adrenaline-triggering levoamphetamine, flooded pharmacies. The Make America Healthy Again doctrine weaponized these medically induced breakdowns. The administration passed state-level legislation expanding the time limits on involuntary psychiatric holds and allowing judges to predictively mandate treatment for anyone deemed a future risk of mental deterioration. By utilizing economic collapse to capture the working class and a toxic drug supply to capture the neurodivergent, the state legally merged the criminal justice and public health systems into a single dragnet. Once legally captured, citizens are physically relocated to state-funded national healing centers. These vast, remote camps are deliberately positioned deep in the Utah desert or the Pacific Northwest, immediately adjacent to deregulated lithium extraction sites and old-growth timber zones. Inside these centers, the state initiates a mandatory 5-day continuous clinical regimen known internally as the Shatter Then Sculpt protocol, utilizing advanced neuromodulation to rewrite the patient's behavior. This 3D model illustrates the shatter phase. Doctors administer continuous intravenous ketamine to completely disaggregate the brain's default mode network. This specific network manages a person's ego, their memories, and their defensive instincts. By chemically dissolving these connections, the brain enters a state of extreme, highly vulnerable neuroplasticity. While the patient's identity is entirely unmoored, the state begins the sculpt phase. Medical staff deliver 90,000 highly targeted electromagnetic pulses into the cortex over 5 days. This forces rapid synaptogenesis, physically fusing new, highly compliant behavioral pathways directly into the cellular structure of the brain. The hardware driving this phase is an accelerated version of transcranial magnetic stimulation. By combining the dissociative drug with the localized magnetic current, doctors bypass the skull entirely to alter deep neural networks without a single surgical incision. The procedure effectively erases the subject's biological threshold for resistance. The mathematical calculation humans use to determine whether an action is worth fighting against is simply deleted from their synapses. The newly reprogrammed citizens are deployed immediately outside the facility doors into incredibly harsh, highly toxic environments to execute heavy industrial labor under the banner of vocational therapy. Because the protocol permanently flatlined their mesolimbic dopamine system, the chemical network that calculates the value of work, their brains no longer generate background reward signals. The only mechanism left to trigger even a fraction of chemical relief is to comply with the grueling, repetitive extraction labor assigned to them by the state. By exploiting this neuroeconomic hijack, the government secures a massive, entirely captive, and uncompensated labor force. Because their biology has been modified, these workers possess zero capacity to organize, demand wages, or attempt an escape. The administration solves its macroeconomic labor shortage by replacing the visible, physical chains of historical forced labor with the invisible coercion of altered neurochemistry. The global reaction to this domestic restructuring is severe. When Chinese intelligence agencies publish a highly coordinated leak detailing the wellness centers as domestic ideological compliance camps, the international community responds with immediate diplomatic sanctions. Historical allies, facing intense outrage from their own populations, rapidly secure new trade and military agreements with rival nations, choosing to pivot away from Washington rather than integrate with an increasingly authoritarian administration. The pursuit of absolute domestic control structurally bankrupts American diplomatic leverage. The United States transitions from a globally integrated democracy into a completely isolated, self-contained system. When a government weaponizes the tools of public health to solve its economic deficits, the definition of freedom is erased at the cellular level. The state no longer needs to build walls to keep its citizens in line, because the prison is already locked inside their minds.